Welcome everyone to our first responder mental health panel. My name is Marcy Smaha and I am the chapter president for the new Chi Upsilon chapter of Chi Sigma Iota, the Academic and Professional Counseling Honor Society. We are the chapter of Bushnell University. Today is Tuesday, March 23rd, and here we are kicking off this first responders mental health panel. Delana Spears will be our moderator for the evening. And so without further ado, I will hand this over to Delana.
Thank you, Marcy. I will introduce myself and then I will let the other panelists introduce themselves so I don't butcher absolutely everything. But I'm Delana. I am a graduate of Bushnell University in December through the CMHC program, and my passion is around first responder mental health. That was what my capstone was on, specifically around law enforcement. And then I am working to build a private practice and consultation business to support first responders and reducing the stigma around mental health. Devin, if you would introduce yourself and then pass it on.
I'm Devin Holloman. I have been working as a 911 and police dispatcher for it'll be 16 years at the end of this year. And I have worked both in Clackamas County at a major 911 center and both for the Lane County Sheriff's Office, as well as I currently work for the Springfield Police Department as dispatcher. And I'm currently pursuing my own master's in clinical mental health counseling through Bushnell, and I'll be done in December of next year, with the intent of working specifically mostly with first responders and around people in that field. So, Greg?
Hello, Greg. I work for the Sheriff's Office, been with the Sheriff's Office for almost 22 years now. It'll be 22 years in May. I've done my time in corrections, so I bring that perspective to this panel. As a deputy, I was on our peer support team. As a sergeant, I supervised the peer support team. I stepped down from that a couple of years ago, and I'm now a lieutenant with the Sheriff's Office at the jail. Brian. And did we lose Brian?
My name is Brian Pop. I'm with the Lane County Sheriff's Office. I've been in law enforcement for approximately 10 years. I was a police officer in Alaska as well. I'm a member of our peer support team. I'm currently in the Crestwell contract, and I too have worked in corrections, so I have a little bit of both perspectives to that. Amber?
Adriel, I'll go ahead and have you introduce yourself.
My name is Adriel, and I got invited to this panel by Delana. I have my master's in community counseling with an emphasis in marriage and family therapy. I'm currently working at an inpatient residential facility with teenagers, but I am married to a first responder and have been for about 8 years now. So I have some personal perspectives and insight to it.
Also, I work in the same facility, and I would say that we also see some pretty traumatic things, and we have a benefit of we have a bunch of therapists on staff, but there is definite stuff there as well. So we're kind of going with the flow this evening. But we're going to start with first of all, I want to acknowledge that we had a shooting yesterday, and one of the officers did pass in the line of duty. So I want to acknowledge that as we kind of step into this, that we kind of have some real world going on that officers across the nation will be experiencing trauma with and have fallout from. In addition to that, looking at some general statistics about why this is important to talk about. As of this morning, there were almost 80 line of duty deaths of officers, 35 suicides. So nearly 50% of what line of duty deaths were, officers also committed suicide. The most recent statistics I could find for EMS or fire was 2017, where 103 EMS personnel committed suicide and 93 line of duty deaths. The average officer is going to see 188 critical incidents in their career. And 50% of law enforcement officers surveyed stated that they knew an officer who committed suicide. Nearly 40% of firefighters and EMS personnel have considered suicide. This is about 10 times higher than that of the general population. So it is something that is a huge presence in the first responder culture, and unfortunately something that is also oftentimes not talked about. And so that's what we're doing here today. Devin, if you would like to start, or one of you would like to start and talk about what things impact your mental health on the job, and where do those pressures come from or situations come from?
Yeah, sure. I think that a big portion of that is shift work and sleep schedule. Obviously, like 18 months on graveyard is going to start to impact your mental health overall. You know, some people do 5-6 years on graveyard before they get off, depending on how big of an agency they work for and what kind of policy they have regarding like rotating back to a day shift. But it's really demanding on your body, especially the older I feel like you get. Graveyard is a lot harder when you're in your 30s than it is when you're 22. And then you will experience loss of like a normalcy in life. So you miss family events. I mean, it's a 24/7, 365 operation. So you miss family events, you miss holidays. If you have kids, you miss kid events. There are shift bids and vacation bids. So when you're new and you're starting out, you pretty much get like the crappy schedule with the crappy days off, and you can be stuck on that for several years. So you may jump right into it and then realize like you're not going to have holidays off with your family. And sometimes families have a hard time understanding why that is, which can create additional just stressors to have, especially if you have a big family. And then obviously we have calls and incidents that stick with us, both having worked as a police dispatcher, a fire dispatcher, and a 911 call taker. I've had significant incidents that impacted me on all fronts. Talking to someone who's doing CPR on their 2-week-old child, having someone scream at you that they're being shot at on the radio, officers or firefighters inside of a house yelling Mayday because the house is collapsing. Like all of those things are super impactful at the time that they're happening. And often you're busy. And so when those things are happening, you don't have time to like step out and be emotionally impacted. You're just expected to just pick up the next call or answer the next radio. And we work 9 or 12-hour shifts. So a lot of times that just, you're just doing that for 5 days a week. And it's not always, burning. It's not always like the whole world is falling apart. But when those events are happening, then your expectation is to just pick up the next call. You don't always have a chance to step away. And then you go home and you don't want to be emotionally impacted for your family and you want to be present. And so, you shove it down. And so I think that those are some of the biggest barriers. We don't have a high number of culturally competent counselors in this area that are super knowledgeable around working with first responders or have expressed a lot of interest in working with first responders. So as agencies that have peer support teams, like looking to connect their members that are struggling or spouses that are struggling, when we try to connect them with people, sometimes they just have really bad experiences. And then that sort of hinders being able to encourage other people to reach out and receive help. So those are all, I think, things that impact mental health and have impacted access to mental health as well, I guess.
Look at Devin go with the big old answer. I don't know how much
Greg
more
or
I can
Brian?
add to that. I'll take a stab here. Totally agree with everything that Devin said. I also think we don't put enough emphasis on the family support. one thing I would say is if you don't know what hypervigilance is, look it up, research it, because that's what we experience every day. And us being in that high hypervigilance for 10, 12, 16 hours a day, coming home and we crash, and that really affects our family because, as Devin said, we don't want to impact them, but at the same time, we don't know how to get out of that funk. So then that adds stress with our spouses. So that's huge because if home is stressful and work is stressful, you have no safe place to go anymore. Other things that affect mental health, I think, especially for like the correction side of things, is in corrections we're not going to have like those, figuratively speaking, those big critical incidences. You know, we're not going to get shot at, be involved in those types of scenarios. But I think for corrections, it's just the everyday grind of facilitating individuals that are in our custody and managing these individuals. A lot of them have mental health issues of their own. And I didn't go to school to be able to manage individuals like this. I don't have all the cool special letters behind my name, but yet society expects us to manage the individuals that are suffering through mental health disorders in a proper, caring way, which is what we want to do, totally. But that adds a total stress level to us because we don't know always what to do to help individuals. And we don't have, I mean, we have a great mental health team at the jail, but at the same time, we don't have the community resources to help those individuals. So long-winded answer to say that I think it's the accumulation of the everyday stressors of managing, 382 people in our facility and individuals that for the most part aren't very good at social interactions. We're having to try to manage them, and that's just a stressful experience for us.
And Greg, you bring up a great point of that hypervigilance around, like, I think everybody understands the fight or flight response. I know that the officers that I know, and a lot of the EMS personnel that I've spoken with talk about that, like that you're constantly in that state. And so just as a therapist, taking in perspective of if you're constantly in that state for that chunk of time, what's going to happen when that adrenaline leaves your body and how that affects your body physically, let alone mentally. So thank you.
Totally. Well, and I think more on that too is just people might view it as, well, people in law enforcement are always got their backs to the wall and they think everyone's trying to kill them. That's not accurate. I do things now that are so second nature to me that I'm not even consciously doing it. But that's still part of that hypervigilance reaction that our bodies are going through. And it's tough for us to come down to what I'm going to qualify as normal.
Absolutely. Brian, did you have any perspective or information you'd like to add?
They covered a lot of it, really. Working a contract where I do, one of the things that we don't have, some of the resources that we don't have are things like cahoots, things like that. So a lot of that is just learning how to deal with people at their lowest lows, and just having those communication skills, which you just kind of build on. And one of the, I guess, blessings in working in a contract is there's a lot of people that I deal with constantly. So I know them. So we have a little bit of a trust and rapport, and you have that in the jail as well to a point. But a lot of it is just understanding your own stress levels and trying to manage those, and just making sure that when you're dealing with people, it's not personal. You're just trying to deal with the person in their situation. So you just don't want to brush things off. You just really want to bring your human aspect to work every day.
Adriel, would you talk to us from the family perspective around like what that trauma looks like at home for the family members and that family support system?
I sure will. Yeah, and so I think, I think a lot of the points that they brought up, like the schedule, the lack of sleep, the sort of like hypervigilance. I know that having like young children, there's a lot of like safety concerns all the time with that, right? Especially from things that have been seen at work. And so that comes into play. And then just sort of the whole family system having to adapt around the schedule or the lack of sleep, or if all of a sudden overtime is forced and then they're gone for, instead of 48 hours, 72 hours, and what that looks like for school and childcare and just all those pieces. And so it does create a lot of unusual barriers. And I know like different departments have different schedules. Some do 24/48, some do 24 on, 72 off, 48 on, 72 off. So it's just, there's always a juggle scheduling wise. And then I think, I notice how there's a lot of support for therapists, like in supervision and things like that. And what I've learned from some of my faraway friends like around the country is that their spouses just don't really get that. And I know some departments are better than others. And, I've had friends whose husbands to addictions, and, there was this husband in Florida he was a captain, and he was using his position to like get into some of the prescription medications. And then it ended up being this, really tragic event. And so a lot of information about like mental health and all that came out from that. But I just feel like there's also a stigma around getting support, especially for families. And so I know like I was on a Fire Wife page on Facebook, and it was a national page. So people from all over the country, and a lot of even wives, or there was female firefighters as well. There weren't males on that page. There was a separate page, but they would use like anonymous names and not, use kind of anonymous descriptions for their department. So I think that's just another piece to think about.
That's a great segue into like talking about, Devin, you talked some, and Adriel, you did too, about the barriers of mental health access in the first responder field. What keeps officers or firefighters and dispatchers from reaching out for support or feeling like they have the ability to do so?
I think that we are, as a culture, law enforcement is slowly shifting away from what was like the old school cowboy mentality. I will say that the agency I currently work for has been the slowest in the area to adjust from that. But we are working on it. But there just was this for, I think the longest time, like if you look back into like people that worked in like the 70s, 80s, even the 90s, the idea was, toughen up, deal with it, cowboy up, like, shove it down. Expressing feelings is weak. And it created this just, generation teaching the next generation of law enforcement for a really long time. And it's just taken a really long time as we've seen, the research and information that's now like becoming available and more easily maybe spread through communities and trainings and things like that, to just raise awareness around it, and to sort of start to shift the culture to like, it's okay to not be okay. It's to have a physiological response to a traumatic incident is a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Like, to start putting words to things that people are simplified enough that like, we understand, and it just starts to make it acceptable. And first responders are stubborn. We are really stubborn. We aren't real trusting in general. I think that just comes out of watching other people be victimized over and over. You just stop feeling like you can trust others. And the reality is, we maybe deal with like 3% of the population 97% of the time, but we just over and over see people in a situation where they like aren't able to trust. You see, the bad, and then you're just like, everything in the world is bad. Can't trust anybody outside of our own box of people. and then we don't ask for help outside of that group, and we struggle with asking for help inside because there's stigma around weakness, and so it's a process, and I really think that we're moving in the right direction, but it's just a very slow moving. Also, we are super, we deal with things in ways that makes reaching out, we're very sarcastic, cynical, have very dark, probably disturbing to a lot of other people's sense of humors, which is, I think, a way that we just process. I mean, we laugh at things that people would just be horrified to laugh at, because it helps lighten it, and you don't want it to take that weight on in that moment. And so you find a way to, and it's probably not healthy, but it's just a thing that we seem to do as a culture. And then you go in and talk to a counselor about it, and you're recalling this traumatic situation, and you're almost laughing about it. And if they don't understand where you're coming from, or where that comes out of, then it's just hard to create, I think, that bond, or to get to a place that you feel like you can really open up and be transparent with that individual. Sorry, that was a lot of words.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I know growing up, so I come from a family of first responders. I know growing up that I learned that what I now know is appropriate dinner talk is not what conversations that we had at the table. I often get funny looks when I bring up a traumatic event, and I'm like, oh, not okay to talk about. Okay, good to know. Does anybody else have anything to add about what has prevented you, or maybe your significant other, in reaching out in regards to mental health or traumatic events that happened on the job?
Yeah, I think Devin really nailed it when she talked about the culture. We are moving forward. We have started breaking some of those barriers down. But the bottom line is when I'm in a housing area, or if I'm, patrolling with Brian and he's counting on me and I'm counting on him, it's tough for me to say to Brian, hey, I'm weak right now, because he's counting on me to be strong every second we're working together. So that's the mentality that we have, and it's tough to then switch it off and say, I'm vulnerable now. Because everyone comes to us when they're vulnerable. We're expected to be the strong ones, the ones that are going to fix the problem, not be the person that has the problem. And so that's the stigma that we as a culture within our own work group need to get over, and recognize that we need to take care of one another. That's the big thing. And I also think the big thing also is time. Collectively, I'd say if I'm going to reach out and ask for help, I need that help right then and there. If it's where I got to make an appointment and I'll see you in 2 weeks, that's too late, because I'm going to go 2 weeks. That's forever. I got this going on. I got this going on. So I think that's a lot of the barrier is that component. I think the other barrier is how a lot of us feel the world views us right now. So if the news is constantly showing, this cop did that, that cop did this, all cops are this, all cops are that, and it's not right. But the bottom line is that negativity that's been shadowed down onto the profession, and some of it's justified. Some cops have done some really bad, awful things, and they shouldn't be in law enforcement. But now we look at everybody that we don't know and wonder, how do they view my profession? And so it then makes it tough for us to open up to somebody like that in a counseling session, because we just don't know that person yet, and we don't have that trust with them yet. So that's the big thing too.
And I also talking about the culture and the having it on the news in your job, right? It's not, also in a way, not like a normal job of somebody complains about the grocery store clerk down the road. A lot of this profession is your identity, and so it's not just they're questioning your career, they're also questioning you as a person, right? Am I a good person for doing this work, and do they believe that I'm a good person? So keeping those bias in mind as working with responders. Brian or Adriel, did you have something to add?
Just a little bit of what Greg said. I mean, part of it is also self-management. When you know that you're off or you're not doing okay, speak up and have the courage to do that. And I'm fortunate enough to work in an organization where if I'm having an off day, I can call somebody and say, hey, I'm not good right now. I need to go home. And just personally, about a month ago, had some issues with my elderly father, and called up one of my supervisors and said, I need to go home. And he was like, okay, go home. So, part of that is, I think you have to take on that responsibility as well, and be able to manage yourself and know yourself well enough to be able to speak up. And it is hard, but if you find the courage to do that, and if you're fortunate enough to work around people who support that, then that kind of helps with your management, and it makes you better available on the next day or next call or whatever, to be able to better manage people. Because I think that's something that's often lost in this profession, is that we're expected to be professional all the time. We're not allowed to have bad days. Nobody knows what's going on in our world, and they just know what's going on in theirs. And we need to, react to what's going on in their world, not ours.
Adriel, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add because, like I said before, I am a mental health therapist, but I am not specifically in the field myself. I will say, though, that I think that from a management perspective, those supports need to be offered and built in, from management and then going down. I think sometimes people aren't going to feel comfortable going and asking for that support or asking for the time off, or maybe their agency or their department doesn't really support that. That's great that some do, but I think, like at our agency, you can be tapped out. If someone can tell that you're off baseline, you can be tapped out and you can be kind of switched. And we deal with a lot of crisis events with teenagers and all that, but self-harm, suicidal things, violence, physical aggression, those type of things, definitely not to the level that police do. But I just think like management recognizing who's struggling and providing support as they can be really helpful.
Greg, you talked about earlier, like if you and Brian were on patrol, like being able to tell him that you were vulnerable, like he's relying on you. So how does that impact peer support? You are a close culture, peer support seem to be the most effective at this point in time, but how does that help in getting officers or firefighters to those services?
Yeah, having a very strong peer support team, to me, is like that first foundational block to get the transition of this culture to move to a place where we want it to be. And I totally agree. Management needs to be on board. If management's not on board, it's not going to work. As Brian said, blessed with the sheriff's office, we have a very supportive management, and so that's great. But peer support, and Brian and Devin can talk about this as well. All three of us were on the team at the same time together. Is when we see somebody that we believe is struggling, then we have an obligation to reach out to them and check in with them and talk with them and see if they will open up to us. And then from there, as Devin talked about earlier, unfortunately, we don't have a strong mental health counselors in our area that either want to work with law enforcement or have the experience to work with law enforcement. But if we can develop that here locally and then develop our peer support teams to have those relationships with those counselors, then we can start moving people in that direction, which will be great for us in the long run, and to develop a stronger mental health field, or stronger mental health awareness within our own field. So I, huge supporter of peer support. I've always encouraged people that are on peer support to be asking and looking out. Our sergeants, if they're seeing something, they'll reach out to the peer support and go, hey, will you check on so-and-so? And then our peer support can do a great job of just reaching out and just checking in on people. Because quite honestly, we're with each other so much that we can tell when something's slightly off with each other, and we just have the courage to tell people that, hey, if something's wrong, you need to talk to me. Let's figure this out.
Great.
I just wanted to add something to that. I heard a story, like I said, the realm that I have exposure to is kind of a fire life, and it was actually that the captain and the team could tell that this particular person was struggling, but it was actually his wife, I think, who reached out to like the captain's wife and said like, he's not okay. This wasn't local, this was somewhere else. And I think his crew basically just showed up at the house. I mean, they took his firearms. They were like, you're not having this in your house, and it was really, really hard for the wife to do that. But it was like he wasn't going to tell anyone how bad he was. And they could kind of tell, but not to the extent that his family could. And so I think that's another part of like families being able to reach out when it gets to that critical point and before. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, I mean, that's a great point. And that was something that we've developed within the Sheriff's Office peer support team, is connecting with spouses. So spouses have a place to connect and call if they see something going on. We also developed we called it a family liaison position. So it was getting spouses of our employees on the team as well. So that way, spouse can talk to spouse, which sometimes is a lot easier to do than for the spouse to talk to one of quote us. So spouses definitely need to be involved in the peer support process for sure.
Great. So I would like to kind of shift into what therapists should know and how they might best work with first responders. So for those of you who are here to gain the knowledge, please feel free to send me questions in the chat and I'll pose them as they come up and as we go through. But panelists, first of all, what would turn you away from a therapist? So you made an appointment, you show up to the first meeting, what would make you walk out of the room and never return to their office?
Politically correct answers.
So somebody that's too politically correct, apparently.
I think for me, it's I don't want to be analyzed is the best way I can describe it. So I think for me, if someone's just staring at their piece of paper and writing notes and going, I don't feel like I'm being heard. So I need somebody that's actually looking at me, engaging with me, asking me questions, and whatever answers I give, don't immediately go to a notepad. Because as soon as that happens, I just feel like they're just taking notes on me and analyzing me, and that's going to turn me off real quick.
I think that it's really important on that first, like I know that like with insurance, the goal is to like get a diagnosis, and once we have a diagnosis, then we can like start, moving forward. But for most first responders, it's going to be really important to at least take some time to establish that trust. Like I'm going to, before I can open up to somebody and just be like, here, let me tell you like the things that I'm really struggling with that I don't really even let people in my inner circle see real easily, before I'm able to just show that to a stranger. Even if it's just a little bit of time where maybe you're willing to, with whatever you're willing to share with them, to kind of become not a stranger. Obviously like everyone has their own boundaries that they're willing to open up to with a client. But if you're talking to me and you're sort of telling me and like making yourself less of a stranger and making yourself a person, if you have like a relatable thing, even with law enforcement, or can somehow, and not just law enforcement, fire, obviously too. But if you can maybe bring somehow around that you're, you don't have to be pro law enforcement, but that you right now, especially in this climate, are not like against us. I feel like a lot of us right now feel like a lot of the world is kind of against us as a whole. And that's just, the media and events that have happened. I mean, we went from last year from being like the heroes for 2 months when COVID hit. And then in May, there was an incident halfway across the country, and suddenly, everybody here is like the enemy too. And that was just a very like 180 response. So even just, I guess, being willing to be transparent on some level there, establishing a rapport. And then also, if you don't have biases, making sure that like we know that, and that you're comfortable with our, like what we do, and or asking questions about maybe that, I don't know, I guess things like that, I feel like just to help establish that.
Adria or Brian, do you have perspective on what might turn responders away from counselors?
I think like Devin and Greg said, I mean, part of that is that bias, but it's just getting to know the person and understanding, like Devin said before, just the gallows humor. I mean, we have that is a big piece of our armor. And if people are offended by that or don't understand it, then we're not going to have that connection. And it's something that I think as a family, and your spouse, you're growing into it, and you understand it a little better. And it's having that dialogue and those conversations. So I know that would, if I saw somebody cringe or something, then I would shut down after that. So for sure.
Body language is huge.
Yep.
We spend our lives analyzing body language, not what's being said to us. So all the words could be said right, but the body language doesn't match those words, we're calling BS.
I'd also, I guess, add a little bit more things of, I put out on a page that I belong to, asking other first responders some of the things that they maybe felt like. One of them, and some of those things were, don't ask about our worst call because you're intrigued. People, and I recognize that maybe that wouldn't be, but people ask us that everywhere. All the like coffee stands, what's the worst call you've ever had? I'm like, why would you want to know that? But it happens very often. What's the craziest thing you've ever been to? To cops, have you ever shot anybody? Like it happens all the time. And so things like that, or don't be more interested in the stories of our jobs. We're really good at storytelling. Things happen, we deal with crazy things, and then you sort of get into storytelling mode, and that sort of can be a barrier. Like we're putting that up instead of like, I can tell you all these funny things that happened, but I'm not going to talk about the things that here. And so, also, I guess just, the sarcasm, we swear a lot, not all of us, but many of us swear a lot, very like openly and comfortably. So if you're uncomfortable with swearing, if you're uncomfortable with first responders carrying guns on their person, that's very likely that they have a concealed handgun license, or they don't need one if they're a police officer, but if they're a dispatcher, maybe they have a concealed handgun license and they carry a firearm on their person. Don't suggest a different job. I mean, sometimes maybe like that's like a last resort. Like if someone right off the bat was like, well, maybe this job isn't for you. Like that's not what we want to hear. We usually love our jobs. It's not a really thankful job. We're not doing it because, everybody's giving us a high five at the end of our shift. So I think that there's a lot of reasons that we like really become connected with what we're doing and the good that we do and the positive things that we can still do to impact the community. So don't suggest, because these are all just things that I've heard from other people who have gone to counseling, and experienced firsthand. A spouse goes in, one has a hard time. The guy at the end will tell your husband, I can fix you. she's like, I'm not broken. And that was it. She wasn't willing to go back to counseling. So, I mean, again, I know that, you know, that's one-offs and hopefully not a situation that any of, you know, you guys would, but there's just, it just can just be one little thing that just really derails. Like it can take so much work to get to that point of asking for help. And so.
Great. Adriel, did you have anything to add before we've got a couple of questions in the chat?
Not really. No, I think that I appreciate what everyone said.
So one question, what can we do as counselors to break down some of those barriers of mistrust when working with first responders?
No judgment.
So I'm going to answer this. Oh, sorry, Craig.
Okay, go ahead. Go right ahead.
I'm not a first responder, but I work with teenagers that have extreme trauma and a lot of PTSD diagnoses. And I think just kind of what everyone's saying, the number one thing is rapport and letting that person letting the client have a sense of control of how and when they want to talk about it. I just think that that's first and foremost. You can't push that. You can't make it happen. And so focusing on that trust piece first, that's what I try to do when I know that, you know, when I'm trying to get a client to like be comfortable with me, open up to me, respect the boundary. If they want to leave after 15 minutes, okay, right? And just let it be. But keep coming back and being present.
Greg, did you have more to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, judgment. You know, everyone's kind of alluded to it. You know, we're gonna say some crazy things, stupid things, inappropriate things. Not because we're trying to be jerks or insensitive. It's just sometimes our brain just thinks that way. It's simplistic for us. So if we say things and we don't get a negative reaction, judgment to that, that's going to keep us talking and keep us opening up. Can't say it enough. It goes back to building that trust with us. That you're seeing me for me and not seeing an object of you're a law enforcement officer, you're this, you're that. I want to be seen for me, if that makes sense.
Brian or Devin? No? Okay. Next question, talking about guidance for crisis planning, things around firearm accessibility, those sorts of things. So as we talked about, suicide unfortunately has very high rates in law enforcement and EMS field. What can we do to help support knowing that firearms are the number one way law enforcement officers commit suicide? 95% of all law enforcement officer suicides are committed with a firearm, and most often with their duty weapon. And then knowing that that's a large part of the job. And so that fear of taking that away.
I guess I'd say, you know, a lot, and like in peer support training, and I'm sure with you guys as well, it's, you just can't be afraid to like pit it. We can't pit around the question, you know, we just got to be like, are you suicidal? Like, yes or no. And sometimes they may not give you that initial response, but coming from a place that's, you know, like they don't want to turn that over, because as soon as they turn over their gun, it's like, this could be career ending for me. You know, some people come back from that. They get help and they return and they go on to have a great career, and it doesn't have to be career ending. So I think reminding them of that, like this is a really tough spot that you're in, but it, you know, it's, and then I think probably reminding them of who's behind, because, you know, I think like 50% of law enforcement officers know someone who's committed suicide or know of someone who's committed suicide. Like it's really high. just in that first responder world. So being like reminding them how much that ripple impacts such a huge, and how like, you know, we don't, because we're all family. Like it's the thin blue line. It's a real feeling of family. I haven't talked to these guys in over a year, and I can call them up and be like, hey, I am doing this panel. Because we're family, and once you're family, you're always part of that family. So I think sort of using that as like a family of like, your family cares about you. We want you to be okay. That sort of reminder of like, because they do, that still has a pull, I think, once you're in that.
Is there a way that counselors could approach, especially the conversation around handguns or other deadly means, in a culturally appropriate way? I know that like my dad, my significant other, my uncles would all be like, there's no way that you're going to have me turn in my guns. But having another officer come and have a conversation with them and be like, hey, I'll put them in my safe, would be a much more approachable situation. So is there something that we could do as counselors, or a way that we could connect with a group or peer supports that would support in that, so that we aren't kind of that aggressive standpoint?
Great. I mean, it would be there. I don't believe that county has gotten a clinician on their team as far as that. Springfield is just forming a team. We're on the very verge of forming our first peer support team. And we don't have a clinician, at least, I mean, there are clinicians in Portland that this is like what they do. So we do have like, we can reach out, but that's a 2-hour away, you know? So teaming someone where you're a part of the triad, chaplain, peer, clinician, and to be someone that where you're part, and you can reach out to the coordinator on that peer support team and be like, hey, you know, usually with the officers, like, let's bring somebody in here that's a peer for you as well, because that may help, you know, bridge that, like, well, can he take your gun, instead of, you know, you having to give it to me, or you having to go to UDH, which is where they take all the people, you know, that are suicidal or in a place like they don't necessarily want to go there. So what are other options? But I think if you want to like team up, be part of a peer support team, that would be amazing. It's definitely needed in this area. Please reach out. It's like, but that would be, you know, then you build up that rapport working with that agency. And so you're not necessarily a stranger. The peer team can speak on your, you know, like, let's bring in so-and-so. And it's sort of a, together we go to address this issue. And then having them turn over their firearm maybe is easier, because it's not just to you, it's also alongside, you know, their peer who they've worked beside for maybe 8 years and they trust implicitly.
Greg or Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Brian, you want to go first?
I think just part of that is kind of like Devin said, just the ability to be blunt when you know something is wrong. I mean, that's the way that we handle suicidal calls as well, is we're very open and honest with those people, and we just ask them directly, are you suicidal? You know, have you thought about it? And you just build off of that. You know, in Alaska, I had the opportunity to help somebody out who was in that state, and you know, got to him the next day, got his firearm back, and he ended up getting help from there. So a lot of that is just, but you have to have that trust built in, and a lot of that is just with a strong peer support team and partnering with them.
Totally agree. And that's a really sensitive topic. You know, asking for a law enforcement officer to turn in their weapon, it's cliche, but it's just like all the movies. You know, you're in trouble, you give it for your badge and gun, and you're suspended, and it looks like you're going to get fired. So whenever we hear that, we're thinking we're getting fired. We're not necessarily worried about my own safety. It's I'm losing my job, and that's going to affect my family. But if in your clinical perspective. If someone's suicidal and we need to get a firearm away from them, is what we got to do. And having the connections with peer support would be a huge way to be able to get that done properly. Because peer support is also going to know what officer is very close to your client. So, and that's huge too, because, you know, if Brian hates my guts, and you're going to send me to try to talk sense into him and get his gun from him, that's not going to happen. Bottom line. So it's important we pick the right people to go in and do this.
Adriel, how can we like enlist the family, right? We want that support system as well. So how can we get that family system involved, and what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I honestly don't have a great answer for that because like I said, I feel like there's that stigma with it. I mean, and I think from what I've heard from different firewives, some departments do really get the family involved, others don't. I think that departments that are more welcoming, just like, hey, come here for the holiday dinner, or let's do this together. Like, you don't have to be friends, but having some sort of like connection on a normal basis helps create that trust where like, you know, if something were to be going wrong, a spouse or a family member would feel comfortable enough to contact someone. And as everyone was talking, I was just thinking about how I do think it's so important to have like a clinician available and on board, like someone who has that mental health training, you know, and I know this is totally different, but also similar. The teenagers at my agency, a lot of them have had very serious suicide attempts. Some of them we get from the hospital, have been hospitalized for 2 months after, you know, strangulation and things like that. And so the first thing we do when they come to us is we do a risk assessment. We do a suicide risk assessment. We talk about, you know, your thoughts, your plans, your intent. Do you have means to it? So if your method is like, I think about hanging myself, do you have any means to get anything that's a string, right? And so if it's firearms, that's a little bit more complicated. And then also like safety planning, like what would qualify as a crisis event? What are your triggers? What are coping tools? Who are your supports? So the crisis event is a traumatic call or maybe a fight with your spouse or something. And then like, it maybe doesn't have to be your captain. Maybe it doesn't have to be like a coworker that you don't like, but who will you call, or who is someone who can like reach out to you, and having that planned before it gets to that point, like having all people, that's just part of what you do. Self-care plans, things like that. So.
And Adriel, as you know, like suicide and suicidal ideation doesn't just affect the person, right? Like that's a huge upheaval in the family. What supports would be helpful for the family unit, especially talking about like you're figuring out childcare, you're figuring out all this stuff on your own on a normal basis. Now add on this really critical situation with your spouse. Mm-hmm. What would be helpful from the clinician or from the peer support in that?
I think, I mean, just the clinician like reaching out to the family or peer support, and also linking those family members with their own mental health. So maybe the wife needs her own counseling. Maybe they need family counseling. You know, maybe the kids are having regressions because of the stress at home, or because what's going on with their first responder parents. So I think just like attempting to offer supports to the system and then kind of like breaking it apart and referring to the appropriate people. Like I said, my realm isn't as much first responders, but these are just the things that come into mind with like how mental health could really impact that in a positive way. I'm just surprised there's no clinicians. Like, that's shocking to me that there's not clinicians available. That seems so, I don't know.
I think it's because really in my experience, for a clinician to be successful, like you need to be willing to give your time. And I know sometimes that's hard because you already have a lot of time constraints. You're, practice, or you're working full time and you've got family, you're adults that have jobs, that have everything. But to really be successful, you need to come and do ride-alongs. You need to come and sit in dispatch. You need to become familiar in that department so that people see your face, people realize you're not weird, because the number one rule in peer support is don't be weird. Like we've had chaplains that come and stand behind you and dispatch, and then they like touch your shoulder, and you're like, don't touch, like, and that just, it doesn't, you're instantly like, we're not talking, we're not, this will never be a thing. And so, but part of that is in order for, if a clinician really wants to like be that person for the team, then that means putting yourself out there and becoming available. And I think that going on ride-alongs in a patrol car, I mean, because first and foremost, you're going to start to better understand, or same thing, fire, go ride along with the fire guys, like if you really want to be that person, I mean, sort of immersing yourself in the culture a little bit so that you can better understand like what that looks like. You become a little bit more of a familiar face. And it's less like, go talk to this person. It's more of like, oh yeah, I remember she rode with so-and-so and so-and-so said that, or he, said that, that they were right. They were kind of cool. They asked questions and seemed generally interested in like what our job was. And that just is going to go like miles, I think, in building that rapport and being able to kind of already take steps towards breaking that ice when it comes time for someone to be like, hey, I need help. And you're not just this stranger. So that's hard. That's hard to ask of a clinician, like on your own time, on your own, when you're not necessarily getting paid in that role, to come forward and just donate time and just be present and get to know us and get to know, our culture. Each department's culture is very different. EPD's culture from Springfield's culture to county, we're all very different departments, very different ways that we operate. And that's, so it's really understanding like each kind of individual department too, I think is another component. Fire has a totally different like structure, the way they operate with like ICS than police. Everything's different. So really, I think being willing to like step into that role, it's a commitment for sure to do that. So to be that chaplain or to be that part of the triad, to be the clinician, really requires some dedication and willingness to put in your own time.
So how would a clinician get connected to peer support? So we're looking at like, we have confidentiality restrictions. So how might we be able to be prepared or make connections in a way that we can reach out to you and have that support, but also maintain confidentiality in regards to clients?
So peer support also has confidentiality. There's an Oregon revised statute which covers peer support, at least between peers as well. So all of the same restrictions that would apply to you, except also for us, we have to report crime, admission of crime, which is obviously different for counselors. So that's the biggest difference. But reports of abuse, reports of self-harm, homicidality, all of those things still fall under mandatory reporting for a peer. But we also, if someone discloses that they have committed a crime, like they're stealing drugs from the evidence locker, like we would be required to report that as well. So I think that ideally, if you have someone come in, and especially if a peer is helping like get them connected with you, then you can ask like, hey, are you cool if I reach out to your peer team coordinator, especially if the person's here for being like a suicidal ideations plan, like if we're addressing that, like, can I reach out with this person? I think, like I said, it's really family oriented in most of our departments. Like people want to take care of each other. And if you say, hey, can I reach out to this person and they can get me connected with a peer with you, it doesn't hurt to ask, I guess, is maybe the answer is no, and that's okay. With a peer coordinator, you can reach out to I can get someone connected to an agent, to an officer that works in a whole nother city. Like if they just want to talk to someone that isn't someone that they see every day, that isn't someone, we can still get that help from somebody. So I think would be really amazing, like long-term goals, I'd love like Lane County to have several clinicians that are working like cohesively with the teams to just keep everybody in a safe place. But I mean, I think that it would be worth asking, and then you're building that rapport as well.
I also think of like as the clinician, right? We provide options, right? If you've done practicum in our clinic, you know, Mindy talks about if you have a suicidal client, like we're going to staff it, we're going to talk about it. And ultimately, if we feel that they're not safe, they can walk over with us to the hospital, or we can call cahoots, like providing these officers and firefighters the same options. Like, I'm worried about you. I feel like I need to reach out to your peer support team or your peer coordinator so that we can get you support. Or I'm going to need to contact these other people that I can break confidentiality around to get you the support that you need. Which would you prefer to do? But Greg, Brian, Adriel, do you have any suggestions on how we might reach out to support teams or to other supports for responders?
I think Devin really covered a lot of it, and that's, again, just having that time to be available. You've got to be a known entity, and really the only way that you can build those relationships is, like she said, either right along in dispatch or with officers or what have you. It would be, I think, huge to see people to just have that resource available, and then again, just through peer support, you know. If somebody on peer support trusts that person, you know, you're already vetted in a sense, then that's going to open up doors for other people and their willingness, I think, anyway.
Yeah, I agree. And I also would say come take a tour of the jail. So that way, if you have clients that are from corrections, you can kind of visualize what, when they start talking about, they're talking about work stuff, you know, hey, I was in the South Annex. Well, none of you know what the South Annex means. So learning that is important. And if you do really want to work with first responders, you know, you can volunteer. We have a lot of volunteer programs within the sheriff's office, and EPD I'm sure does too in Springfield. So even if you just want to volunteer just to get your face known in other areas, just to start bonding with everybody, that'd be a good way to do it too. And then if you want to volunteer time to peer support, that's another way, because then we can connect you with the peer support team and quote, get you on the team, so to speak. And that's another way for doors to open too. But I almost forgot. But the big thing about giving choices, that's huge. I would much rather you tell me you have option A, B, C, or D. Pick one, and let me make that choice.
Hey, Joe, did you have anything to add?
Not much. The only thing that came up in my mind is just, you know, speaking about having a clinician who is like going on ride-alongs, doing all that. I know I've done ride-alongs before, and that was really insightful, just like from a personal standpoint, and in like the profession. And I think having that clinician have it be a part of like a mandatory prevention thing that, I don't know how it goes, like the ranks, but supervisors or whatnot, like every person there has to have a safety plan in their file, and it talks about what a crisis event would be and who their supports are and who they feel comfortable with. Like just having that already available and like reviewing it in supervision times, meetings, things like that. Like I think that that's something that like a clinician could do as a preventative measure. Like not when someone's already in the crisis, but what would happen to cause you to get there, or what might be triggering for you. Maybe it's like a call with like really young kids because you have young kids, or maybe it's like, you know, the really, yeah, I don't know. That's just what came to my mind.
Yeah, and Adrian, that's a great point, and I'm glad that you brought it up. I know that so our facility, Adrian and I work at, it's an inpatient residential facility for teens, but it's completely locked down. Like you have to have keys to get in and out. We've had several large escalations and situations where we gave up our keys to other staff because kids were trying to get them and it wasn't safe. So those situations can be triggering and have all of these things. And we have the ability to, prior to this, have had conversations of these things can be triggering for me. This is what shows up when I'm having a hard time, or when I might need to be tapped out, or when I might need extra support. And I feel like would be a good thing to model elsewhere. Again, we're very lucky that we get to work with a bunch of therapists. There's like 6 of us on staff at this point, in various capacities in our facility. Another question, curious about what getting help looks like for suicidality or addiction when responders may have concerns about confidentiality in their communities because of crossover with professional relationships and identity. So I'm assuming like you oftentimes are going to work with addictions clinician in a professional role, and now you're needing to go to them for support, those sorts of things.
The only piece I would say is I think that's totally valid. And I think that that is a barrier and why a lot of people maybe don't want to seek help in their community, especially like small areas, small departments, small towns. But we are getting a lot more online resources, so that's something that like departments should offer to people struggling. Is like, hey, maybe you don't want to see someone locally, but you need to see, maybe we can set you up with someone online, or there's all kinds of like online therapy options and specialists for AOD stuff and things like that. So that could be helpful.
I think because we're working on building like aware of the fact that people aren't as maybe likely to accept help in their own community for fear of like addiction help. People aren't necessarily going to want to go down to Serenity Lane because of concern of crossover, and just even maybe like feeling like they might run into someone and that would just be really difficult. But there are a lot of connections that, at least with like peer team, again, so if peer team, you can make a call and be like, I have a 35-year-old officer guy who needs, substance use with cocaine. And, that's really all they need to know, minimal information. And then they can set something up and it'll be out of the area. So, and then can work. So there are a lot of local agencies have resources like that in place or availability to get people help outside of the area. So again, that's where like if we can build those bridges where clinicians are working alongside peer teams, just think that that would just offer a lot more resources for us to, someone comes to you for help, you realize that there's a substance abuse disorder that really like needs, to be addressed, and then can offer them resources and get them connected where they don't have to go to help down the street, where they've taken people or arrested people, things like that. It just helps avoid that as a thing.
Yeah. Gregor, Brian, do you have input on that area, like that crossover?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think I would say this is the best way to battle some of that with take out the drug disorder and all that stuff for a second. If it's just strictly just counseling components, is it goes back to the trust. If you've established trust, then it doesn't matter to me if you see other individuals that there might be quote community crossover. But Devin's right, if it's coming to drug addictions and stuff like that, I'd have a hard time going down to like Serenity Lane, because a whole bunch of individuals there I just dealt with inside jail. And so I'm not going to want to do that, because I'm going to show a vulnerable side to them that I don't want to show. So being able to have other resources that are fairly close would be beneficial, because I ain't driving to Port.
I mean, just I guess to know as counselors that at least most first responders are going to have an employee assistance program available to them through their work. And that probably will include options for addictions counsel, like addictions, like outpatient or inpatient potentially, depending on the different programs. So just being aware of the fact that most, because you're talking city, county, state kind of agencies, those agencies usually have some sort of employee assistance program. It will likely include, so even if they don't want to reach out to their peer team, or even if you don't want to, break confidentiality, they may just be able to say, like, let's call together, let's call your EAP and see what kind of resources, are available, or sometimes that information's online. And so then you can at least start to connect them with things that way their, insurance and their employer, it's sort of a cohesive thing, and they can work on getting them somewhere that's maybe not quite so local that it's in our backyard either. But that is a thing that should be available, at least in this area in Oregon. I think most of the law enforcement, and I think probably most of the fire agencies, have EAP, employee assistance programs, that will cover or at least help get someone towards that if they've said, hey, I have a problem with addiction.
And then who would a clinician get in contact with, or how would they get in contact with the peer support team to be a part of that or to start that process?
Well, for Springfield PD, it will be me. For county, I don't know, you can reach out to Greg, or you can reach out to, like, I can connect you with peer support people from EPD, county, or Springfield. If you reach out to me, I can make that happen. If you haven't, like, find the people you need to talk to for Eugene, Springfield fire, things like that, like, definitely can make that happen. So I'm happy to be the person that's the middleman to make connections for people, if that's something that you're interested in doing.
And I can assist there as well for the county.
So I know that we've talked a lot about law enforcement this evening. I also want to highlight a couple of specialty areas. So like Devin talked about dispatch. As a dispatcher, they have little control in situations and are going blind. They are on the other end of the phone trying to help support, as well as on the other end of the radio. And like she said, once you're in your family, and then you may hear an officer in distress or a firefighter in distress. And what does that do to you when you are literally powerless and doing nothing more than sending other officers and doing the support that you can, but you physically cannot be there. And then corrections is its own beast as well. You may not deal with it on a regular basis, but like the potential for riots and aggravated assaults are there. And oftentimes, at least in the experiences that I have, you are not as armed as other officers. And so it's a whole different ballgame there. Adriel, I would love for you to speak about what the impact is to your kids and to yourself having your husband come home from some of those traumatic, because he does some more rescue stuff, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's an internal processor. So I think there's not a lot of processing at home about those things. And, he's been in it for a while. So I think maybe if I knew him in his early years of his career, it would be different, right? We met a little bit later. So that's a different piece of it. But I will say I think a stressor on the family is just always sort of having to adapt and be flexible. And just if they come home and they're tired or grumpy, or you just kind of have to be supportive, right? And that's and I think grown-ups can understand that. Kids, it can be hard, right? Especially little kids, they don't understand that. And so yeah.
Thank you. I am gonna let Devin, Greg, and Brian Adriel give some final thoughts before we wrap up. But if anybody has any last minute questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll ask them before we kind of wrap up here. Devin, did you want to start with any last minute thoughts or?
Sure. I feel like I've already talked so much. I guess I just like dispatch is really its own area, and that, like she said, we don't have control, and sometimes we're forgotten about a little bit. Oftentimes when there's critical incidents, the guys, whether it's fire or police, will sort of do a self debrief, like they'll debrief together at the scene, like after a little bit, or check in with each other. And we're like still back in this windowless room, continuing to take calls and do our job. And so sometimes that can be a difficult component, is that we don't get closure often. I mean, if we ask for it, I say the guys and girls that I work with are great at following up. If I send a message and be like, hey, what happened on that call? They will absolutely pop in and tell us. But a lot of time, like most of the time, we don't know the outcome of the calls. And it's pretty rare that we ask unless we're like it's nagging at me. So most of the things that we deal with, we're dealing with people on their absolute worst day, and we don't always know what we're sending people into. And so we have the people from the public that we're having to deal with, but we're also often worried because we're sending our brothers and sisters out into situations that we know are super dangerous. They're going to go deal like an active shooter. You are sending people, they're becoming more frequent, but they're not super frequent. But having worked an active shooter when I worked at the town center, like you are sending your brothers and sisters into a situation where there is someone that is actively killing people. And that is just hard to do. It's hard to like turn off the emotions part of your instinct and just do your job. And we're good at doing that, but then you have to like try to put the emotions back on. And that sometimes is a challenge to like do that and continue to to not have a disconnect there. But I'm real excited that this is just becoming a thing that even we're just able to have a platform to talk about it. So just thank you for making it an option and making it a thing where it's being spoken about. It's really important, and it's really exciting to have people curious and interested in just understanding what it's like, because it's a really unique culture that we have, and we deal with some pretty messed up stuff, and people definitely need people to be able to reach out to and get genuine help from sometimes. So for all of you that are here, I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate that.
I'll go next. I'll echo what Devin said. Appreciate everyone's interest. This is something that's been lacking for us for a long time. So I'm excited to see other people that are interested in us. And I think something that gets lost a lot is we want to talk about the big events. But I really think for the majority of people, it's not the big event that is what is causing our brothers and sisters to commit suicide. I really think it's the collection of the everyday grind, the little things, and those get lost. And I think to really help each other, I think we need to learn how to manage those little events and not let them just sit in our bucket. That's what Devin's know what I'm about to say. We've talked about it many times, but we have a bucket and it just keeps getting filled with the crap. And then one day that bucket is overflowed. And it can be the most silliest, stupidest thing in the world that caused that bucket to overflow. So I would encourage that if you have somebody sitting across from you, dive into the little things and see how we can manage, fix, however you want to call it, the little things. So that's actually what's going to save us in the end.
I'll go next just to kind of wrap up. I don't have a lot to say, but I really like what you just said. And I did a lot with clients, like especially clients who are suicidal and things like that. Just kind of say back to the basics. Like, did you drink water today? Did you get any sleep? Who's one person you can check in with? Just, yeah. big things, and the small stuff adds up definitely. And I think one thing that I've heard, just one family I knew that implemented it is like they were both first responders, and they would get off work, get off shift, and come right home, and they implemented like a 1 to 2 hour buffer period from when they got off to when they needed to be home. And whether that was like ride your motorcycle home, go sit at a coffee shop and drink coffee, like there was just this buffer between work and home, and it was like a self check-in time. And I know my boss has encouraged me to do that even as a therapist. Like before you go home, when you leave from a really rough day, is there something you can do for 30 minutes before you walk in your front door? So I think that that's just addressing those like little pieces that you can control, and that like self-care and just building yourself up a little tiny bit. That's important, I think, for clinicians to think about.
And all I'm going to add to all of that is just, again, thanks for this platform and opportunity. We just, again, like everybody said, it's it's having the ability to know yourself, but also having someone that you can share that with. And again, it's just take care of yourselves before you can help anybody else. That's where it all starts.
So one last question that seems like it'll be great to wrap up on is, are there any recommendations for resources such as books, documentaries, websites as a starting place for becoming more culturally competent when it comes to working with first responders? I know two of the books that I used for my capstone thesis was Counseling Cops. It was great. And then Mindfulness for Warriors, which is written it's written by a wife of an officer who committed suicide. And then it's a collection of stories of other responders and what they learned and what they would hope the first responder community would be able to gather from to become more mentally strong in that aspect. So those two are great, but Greg, Devin, Ryan, or Adriel, do you have any suggestions?
Anything written by Dr. Gil Martin.
Okay.
Kevin Gilmartin is his first name, but he writes a book that's very big. And then Stephanie Kahn, who's a counselor that just deals with first responders out of Portland area, wrote a book called Resiliency in First Responders, something right, Resiliency, and her name is Stephanie Kahn is the author. But that book is also geared towards like first responders and kind of the job, like what the job is and being able to endure through that.
Lieutenant Dave Grossman is another good read. I know it's just, but those others as well for sure.
The only thing I can think of, and I'll have to send you this article, Dorian, but it's one I told you about that kind of talks about like the physiology of the body and what happens when you're in that constant fight or flight response, and how first responders' bodies jump to that way quicker, like their adrenal glands release these hormones and these things way quicker than like a normal human body, basically, because of the high stress environment. And then sort of that like effect that it has, the snowball effect, and how that carries into like different pieces of life where the reaction is bigger than the event. And so it's really interesting because it talks about all the brain side of it. But I don't know the name, so I'll have to send it to you.
Thank you. I'm going to say there's also, I think it's the handbook for families of law enforcement officers. It's a red book, red and white cover with a badge on the front of it. I can't think of the name off the top of my head.
I think that's Kevin Gilmartin's book.
It's that one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will compile a list as an add to the one that I have for my capstone, send it to you, Marcy. But there's also first responder seminars, I think is what it is, or similar, that they are doing lots of great stuff. They have lots of officers and firefighters and family members come on. They just did one about being married to PTSD. Both individuals are part of law enforcement and have a military culture. It was about an hour long or so that they kind of told their story and the impacts of their job on their marriage and their life and how they made it through. So it was great. And there's been several others. So I'll make a list, Marcy, and send it to you so that you've got it to send out with the link. All right. If there aren't any other last minute questions or last minute thoughts, we can go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate everybody coming. Brian, Greg, Devin, and Adriel, thank you so much for coming and speaking your perspective. It's greatly appreciated for you to take your time and speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Marcy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Delana. I absolutely echo Delana's thanks. Devin, Greg, Brian, and Adriel. This has been incredibly enlightening, and I greatly appreciate the years of experience, the knowledge, the insight that all of you bring to this panel, that you're bringing into your lives, your professions, the amount of change that you are eliciting in the world just by, being here and willing to kind of step up, take that courage, kind of be vulnerable and show up and cut the crap, say it like it is. Like, just really, really appreciate you taking the time to be here and doing that. On behalf of our CSI chapter, on behalf of those of us who are present tonight, those of us who will watch the link, I greatly look forward to getting this list of resources, Delana, and I will make certain it goes out to our full membership along with the link. This has been a wonderful evening, and thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight.
Thank you. Good night.